I'd love for you to share some of your top of the mind lessons learned pieces in light of the conversation that we're having.
Okay, well, let me actually answer that by telling a little story. 8 or 9 years ago, a couple of, or really one organization that funded a lot of LGBT work, essentially commanded about 10 or 11 of the organizations doing the work on the ground to come to a meeting and talk about the fact that they weren't working collaboratively enough. And at that meeting, the folks who came together recognized in one of those great light bulb moments that the real problem was actually something I think that Hollis articulated very well, which was we were all focused on the next 6 months or the next year, and nobody was thinking very much about what the long-term vision was. And the folks who came together there trusted each other enough to create a process I'll describe in a minute, designed to come up with 3 things. Designed to come up with a shared vision. Now again, we were just talking about marriage, so we're talking about a much smaller scale. But designed to come up with an idea of what the ultimate vision was. What, in rough terms, the pathway to get from where we were to there ought to look like. And then what that meant that we ought to be working on in the short term. And to try and create a pathway that recognized that there are all sorts of different ways, research, policy, religion, politics, to get from, that can be part of getting from one place to another. And I think this is critical about the process. The folks who sat down to try and hammer that out were not the leaders of the organizations. And they were not, there were no sort of organizational slates. We let a couple of people basically hand-pick what I would call people who were doing the hands-on work to get together and try and create that vision. I don't want to kid you and suggest that it was a completely smooth or pretty process. It wasn't. It took a long time. But in the end, we actually did develop something that we could sit down with about 10 or 11 of the major organizations who were working hardest on the issue and say, we've got a shared vision, we've got a shared understanding of what the pathway to get there is, and we know the next things that we need to do in the short term. Now, it's a much smaller issue, but I will also say that at the ACLU, we've started with almost all of our issues of trying to do precisely the same thing, which the organization hadn't had before, of developing on each of the issues we work on a sense of what the long-term vision is, the pathway to get there is, and what we need to do in the short term. And ultimately, we hope to weave that together into a single organizational vision. Now, I don't, as I said, look, the marriage issue is much smaller than this, than what you're trying to create here. But I do think that process, maybe there's something maybe there's something to it. It involves an enormous amount of trust, an enormous amount of people putting, sort of their organizational interest in their organizational priority on hold for it to work. But it did work there. One other thing I want to say, when people try to weave a shared vision, one of the things that I've seen most often get in the way early on is a struggle to find commonalities across issues. And I remember dealing with this with a anti-affirmative action ballot initiative in California and trying to talk to the LGBT community around it. And I thought the commonalities that people were often suggesting rang false to people on both sides of the issue. And it's always seemed to me that the commonality is the opposition. I think we are united by our opponents. Their arguments, their tactics, the things they use to defeat us are always the same. They're the same across the board. And we don't really need, I think, any greater commonality than being united by our opposition.